Hi, welcome everybody to Women Without Borders. We have a really amazing panel of women authors writing both fiction and nonfiction titles of women doing amazing things. And women have done amazing things throughout history. And I just always appreciate these wonderful tales that inspire and encourage us along the way. So, and we want to thank Penguin Random House and Scholastic and Simon & Schuster for supporting our spring forum. And I am going to pass it over to Mary Williams of Skylight Books.
Thanks, Anne, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm delighted to be here speaking with these three California authors about their new books, all of which are centered on women's stories. I'll introduce each of them in turn, and they'll have a chance to tell you a bit about their book for about 5 minutes. And after that, I'll moderate a discussion among the authors, and there will be time at the end for your questions, and you can just go ahead and drop those into the chat. So let's get started. Our first author is Lauren Delaney Miller. She has dedicated her life to exploring the mountains of the world and telling stories of underrepresented people. Delaney Miller is deeply involved in the climbing community, serving as vice president of the Bishop Area Climbers Coalition and event coordinator for the American Alpine Club. She is a regional editor for the American Alpine Journal, Accidents in North American Climbing, and the Cutting Edge podcast. After 3 years with Yosemite Search and Rescue, she is embarking on a new adventure at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Delaney Miller lives in Bishop with her husband and rescue pup. She is here today to present Valley of Giants, Stories from the Heart of Yosemite Climbing, out now from Mountaineers Books. Lauren, take it away.
Thanks so much, Mary. Thanks to all for being here. This is really exciting for me. Like Mary said, I'm in Bishop, California right now, which is my home base, but I spend a lot of time over the last year in Berkeley, where I'm in grad school in journalism. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about Valley of Giants. It's an anthology that I put together over the past couple of years that has 39 stories and about 24 photos. And it's all about the history of women's climbing in Yosemite. Within the world of climbing, we often talk about time in terms of eras or generations. And so my book is organized that way as well. And it starts at the very beginning of when ropes were brought to climbing in California in the 1930s and goes all the way through to the present day. The stories kind of take two different forms. One is stories that were already previously written. And so those are things like letters maybe that were written from women as far back as the 1930s. And there's interviews transcribed from oral histories, excerpts from memoirs and articles that were published in magazines. And then the other half of the stories are commissioned just for this collection. But importantly, each story is written in the first person by that climber herself. And that was really important to me because this whole book came about because I noticed this gaping underrepresentation of women in climbing. And so I wanted to have each women's voice be included as well, as opposed to, say, me rounding them all up into my own perspective. And so each story is in the first person, which is something that was really important to me. Like Mary mentioned, I worked for 3 years on the Yosemite Valley Search and Rescue team, and I really noticed how important women were in that community. And it wasn't really something that I was totally aware of before because the literature surrounding Yosemite doesn't really make it seem that way. And the more I kind of went back into the history while working on this book, the more I really found that the lineage of women within the sport of rock climbing, especially in Yosemite, which is, of course, the mecca of American rock climbing, or that lineage of women really goes all the way back to the very beginning, which to me, and I think to others, really brings this sense of belonging within the climbing community that we might not have known about before, that women weren't just a later accessory in addition to climbing, as often is represented, but that women were involved in first descents and forging equipment and putting up new routes and, every aspect of the sport since the very beginning. And I think that my own personal connection to Yosemite, having spent years climbing there and then working there, really gave me that window to see how important women were to that community as a whole. And yeah, the subtitle is something that we spent a lot of time with at Mountaineers going over. But to me, thinking of this as stories from women at the heart of Yosemite climbing was really key to why this whole collection came together in the first place. There's stories of climbers, but not even every one of them has to do with climbing itself. It's about really being part of that community in Yosemite and being really pivotal. You're right, really at the heart of what that community means. And so I wanted to show you two quick, tell you two kind of quick behind the scenes stories for what it was like to kind of put an anthology together, which of course is something I had never done before. Let's see, so if I go here. Okay, I think you should be seeing a black and white photo. Is that right? Okay. This is Bee Vogel, and she is an amazing woman that I've learned a lot about. I found this photo in an old magazine from the Stanford Historical Collection. Bee was an undergrad at Stanford in the early 1950s. And the caption for this photo just said that Bee Vogel was forging pitons at the Stanford Engineering Lab in 1952. And, you know, climbing in that day was done with this really heavy iron equipment. And, you know, at the time, the literature really shows that women were kind of an accessory, often climbing with their boyfriends or partners, not really that pivotal to the sport. And something about finding this woman who was literally crafting her own equipment just to go climbing with really changed that narrative in my head and felt like the perfect proof that we needed to show how important women were to the sport. But of course, I couldn't just take this picture from the from the magazine and put it in my book. And I ended up on a year-long goose chase to track down Bee's family. She passed away about 3 months before I saw this photo. I ended up, you know, after trying social media and all sorts of things online to try to find her family, ended up finding an address in the white pages and sending a letter in the mail to an address that I thought might belong to her family. And luckily for me, it did. And I've been able to learn a lot else about her. She was the first woman that was ever certified to lead rock climbs by the Stanford Alpine Club, which was a huge deal at the time when the National Park Service required that climbers register with the Park Service to go climbing and have a certified leader. She really was someone that opened that door for generations of women after her. The other story I wanted to tell you about real quick is around this photo. I first saw this photo when my friend Jane posted it on her Instagram, because that is her mom on the left, you know, the blue there. And she just said, check out this cool picture of my mom. And of course I said, I need that picture in my book. And but Jane's mom only had kind of a crumpled copy of it in a photo album. And of course I also needed to get the permission of the photographer. The photographer of this photo has also passed away. And so I ended up once again on a goose chase to try to track down a way to get this photo in good quality in my book. I was able to talk to the photographer's family, and they were happy to have the photo included if I could find a good copy of it, but they did not have one either. And so months later, Jane's mom told me that this had been in a magazine, had been in Rock and Ice magazine. I think it's 1982. And she said, maybe you could find a copy of a magazine and it would be in better condition than the crappy photo that I have that's all crumpled up. And so I ended up finding the editor who had been George Baraksiak, who had been the editor of Rock and Ice at the time, who of course had a copy of a pristine off the press copy of this magazine, even though it had been so long. And I PayPal'd him $10 for the shipping, and he sent me a copy, and I brought it to the art supply store in Bishop, and we scanned the magazine. And you know, and even though it just took me about a minute to tell you this story, that took almost, you know, 9 months of my life of going back and forth with the permissions and trying to track down the photographer and the people in the photos and get a really good quality version of it. So believe it or not, this is a scan from a full page magazine. And I'm just, yeah, this photo is one of many that kind of shows me, yeah, just the sort of style and heart and grit that women have always brought to the sport of rock climbing. This photo was taken to kind of make fun of some of the guys at the time who tended to pose in this really macho way in front of El Capitan after they went and climbed it. And the women decided, you know, what we can do, what you can do, we can do better. And I just love this photo as an example of, yeah, of what women can do and what women have always been doing in a place like Yosemite. Let's see, I'm gonna stop. Okay, stop sharing my screen, I think, but yeah, and so Valley of Giants really is this book that's just so important to me. And, you know, I started out just hoping to capture a bit of history. I felt like we'd already lost the opportunity to talk to the first generation of women climbers in Yosemite. And so I felt like, if nothing else, I just need to get some of this history done on paper. But since then, I feel like I've just learned so much more and connected even more to a place that's been really important to me. Yeah, and it's just been so cool to get to share that with people and to kind of help share that message that women really belong in Yosemite and belong within the world of rock climbing and outdoor sports, and really have always been a part of that community.
Now I'm the one on mute. Okay, thank you, Lauren. That was great. Love hearing the behind the scenes stories of how that came together. Next, we have Dr. Natalia Holt. She is the New York Times bestselling author of The Queens of Animation, Rise of the Rocket Girls, and Cured. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, Slate, Popular Science, and Time. She lives with her husband and their $2 in Pacific Grove, and she's here today to present Wise Gals, the spies who built the CIA and changed the future of espionage, out September 13th from Putnam. Natalia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's so fun to be here. Now, I came to this story about 5 years ago, and I was interviewing a woman who worked in liberated concentration camps at the end of World War II. And as you can imagine, these interviews were overwhelming and heartbreaking. This was a private interview, so I knew it was not going to become a published book or a story. But there was one part of our interviews that really stayed with me, and that's because it involved a very well-known Nazi war criminal and a shadowy American woman. And so I began digging, and what I learned was that this woman that I had heard of was actually a counterintelligence agent in an elite American group called X2. And she wasn't alone. She was one of a large group of women who worked as spies for American intelligence. And these women were essential in forming the CIA after their service in World War II. Now, these women were called Wise Gals by their male colleagues, and this was because they were intelligent, but also because of their very biting, sarcastic humor. And the Wise Gals were spread all across the globe. And in this book, I tell the stories of 4 women. So first is Adelaide Hawkins. She was a divorced single mom of 3 kids. And despite having a 40-year-long career in espionage at the CIA, she managed to keep her career a complete secret from her family. And she did all kinds of amazing things, including creating really fun, cutting-edge spy gear. And then there's also Eloise Page. She is a very perfect example of a Southern woman. She was raised in Virginia. She wore white gloves and pearls, but also occasionally tucked a gun under her arm. She was a secretary to Bill Donovan in World War II, and Bill Donovan is the father of American intelligence. But she went on from that to become one of the most powerful women in the CIA. She was the head of scientific and technical operations, and then later became the first female station chief, a position she inherited from her predecessor, who was actually assassinated by terrorists. There's also Mary Hutchinson. And so she was just a real force of a woman. She had a PhD in archaeology, was fluent in 4 languages, had a military service in World War II. And yet, despite all of this, when she applied for a job at the new CIA, she was offered a secretary position. And you can imagine she did not stand for this. She said very bluntly, quote, "That is a waste of my abilities." And to her credit, she was then hired as a counterintelligence agent and sent to Germany, where she began forming the first American spy network with Ukrainian nationals, a story that sadly is still very relevant today. And lastly, there's Elizabeth Sudmeyer, who was sent to Syria and then Iraq, where she was able to form her very own spy networks, doing dead drops in cafes and movie theaters with women that she recruited herself from a tailor shop and from a hair salon. And together, these spy networks were able to get just an avalanche of intelligence, including top secret blueprints to Soviet fighter planes. Now, this network came under threat in 1958 when the Iraqi government toppled. And during this revolution, Americans were targeted and killed in Baghdad. So immediately, every CIA officer fled the country. Every single one except for Liz. She is the only one that stayed. And she stayed because she wanted to protect her spy network in Iraq, even though she knew it might cost her her life. Now, my book doesn't just deal with their professional careers. I also talk about their personal lives. And one example of this is Liz Sudmeyer, who, in addition to her long career in Iraq, also fell in love with an Italian man who she desperately wanted to marry. But when she was told that she either had to choose her career at the CIA or marry the man she loved, she decided to stay with the CIA. Now, in 1953, one event brings all of the wise gals to CIA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and that is called the Petticoat Panel. Now, this panel was the efforts of a group of women to finally bring equity into the agency. And of course, this was just unheard of in the 1950s. Nobody was doing panels like this. But you have to remember that this group of women were commanding their own operations. They had a lot of responsibility. But despite this, they were not getting the salary and the promotions that they deserved. And so they formed this panel, and the experience was just frustrating. It was maddening. And so the women really leaned on each other. They shared their private experiences, what they had gone through, and some really deep friendships formed. And the Wise Gals wanted to do the Petticoat Panel, not just to bring themselves recognition, but really for the next generation of women. And so what we see is that it's these efforts that then become essential in making the CIA what it is today, which is an agency where more than half of the officers are women. Of course, the Wise Girls did a lot more than government panels. These are women that, no mistake about it, prevented war. And they did it in small, unheralded operations, most of which have not been written about in any books before, but took place during very tense, difficult conditions between the United States and Soviets. So not only did the Wise Gals really keep us safe during the Cold War, but their experience provides really important lessons for our modern conflicts today. So my book comes out on the 75th anniversary of the CIA, and an anniversary is just, it's a great opportunity to look back and see how far we've come. And so my hope is that this book will finally give these women the recognition that they so deserve. And particularly for one woman who, I don't want to give any spoilers for the book, but she really made the ultimate sacrifice for her country. And yet the CIA still hasn't properly memorialized her death. So yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here and get to share this little slice of their experiences with you. And I'm looking forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Natalia. It's so interesting what these women accomplished in that era. All right, so let's turn to Jennifer Coburn. She is an award-winning journalist who has written for magazines and newspapers throughout the United States, Canada, and Australia. A native New Yorker and a graduate of the University of Michigan, she has 6 published novels and is a contributing author to 4 anthologies. She currently lives in San Diego with her husband and daughter. She's here today to discuss her novel, Cradles of the Reich, out October 11th from Source Books. Take it away, Jennifer. Oh, you're on mute, sorry. Still on there.
Better? Am I unmuted? This is a book about women unmuting themselves, being heard. Can you hear me now? Oh man, am I still on mute?
No, you're good. Go.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
Great
I muted
start.
myself.
Okay.
Go for it.
Cradles of the Reich is a historical novel about 3 very different German women who meet at a Nazi Lebensborn breeding program and change the course of one another's life. The Lebensborn Society was Himmler's plan to create 2 million new babies for the so-called master race. And the way that the Nazis did this was 3 different approaches. One, they arranged sexual liaisons between Aryan women and SS officers. It also served as a maternity home for unwed girls, and they kidnapped blonde-haired, blue-eyed children taken from German-occupied countries. Now, when I first heard about this program, I was both horrified and fascinated. And I had so many questions about how this program worked, how the women were selected, and why would these young women choose to have sex with a man that they just met, men they just met, because they thought it was their patriotic duty. When I searched for answers, I found many nonfiction books, but there were no novels. So I decided to write a novel that I wanted to read with my book club. Researching the Lebensborn Society and Nazi culture was the most interesting endeavor of my life. I read every nonfiction book on the Lebensborn program, watched documentary films and Nazi propaganda films, but what provided me the deepest insight was speaking to German elders who lived during that era. Among them was Rolf Schultz. He was 7 years old, living in Berlin, and described to me in vivid detail how he felt the morning after the pogroms that the Nazis dubbed Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Rolf was a member of the Deutsche Jungen, which is the younger arm of the Hitler Youth, and he spoke to me with great candor about his fear of Jews and his early love of Hitler. As an old man, he is repentant and he understands the evils of Nazism, but he spoke very plainly about how he and his friends were influenced by Nazi propaganda. What I found the hardest part of my research was understanding the cultural details of Nazi Germany. In addition to consulting experts in propaganda, in architecture, and in food, I reached out to Bernhard Schlink, who is the author of the bestseller, The Reader. And he helped me ensure that that the linguistic and cultural details of the novel were authentic. Lebensborn Society is a historical novel which explores the Lebensborn program through the stories of three fictional women. First, there is Gundi. She is a righteous Gentile involved in the student resistance movement and secretly pregnant with her Jewish boyfriend's baby. Not only has Gundi fallen in love with this Jewish man, but she has also discovered a deep connection to the faith and culture of Judaism. Then there's Hilda. She is a true believer in Hitler's cause. She's excited to be pregnant with a married SS officer's baby, and she is eager to be a part of the new Reich. And third is Nurse Irma. She is a bystander who must finally choose sides. The story examines how most German citizens fell in line with the Nazis, but how some rose to heroism they never knew they were capable of. I love talking about the Nazi Lebensborn program, the research that went into this book, and my novel with readers. So I'd love to engage in a conversation with guests at your bookstore and with you through the Q&A. And thank you for having me here, Kaliba, to talk about Cradles of the Reich.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, it really is such a fascinating novel, those different, the way the different characters intersect. So thank you for being here. Okay, great. So if you have any questions for our authors, feel free to drop them in the chat. I also have a million questions for these lovely ladies, so I will kick it off. Natalia, you dive into your characters' personal lives, as you mentioned, as well as their professional lives. And their personal lives included some unhappy marriages, some children who struggled. What toll did the work take on these women personally? And then also what price did they pay at the CIA for having husbands and children at home?
Yeah, it's interesting for this group of women because you sort of have the whole spectrum there. You have a woman that's divorced, you have one that's married, you have one that's never married, and one who sort of desperately wants to become married. For each of them, of course, it's a difficult experience, but certainly the CIA came first in their lives, which is really saying a lot because these aren't women that were being promoted easily or getting big pay raises for their work. They really did it because they loved their country and they believed in the work they were doing. So for their personal lives, we really see in the book where they are just struggling, sometimes struggling to keep afloat. So Adelaide Hawkins, who's the divorced mom, just becomes desperate, trying to figure out childcare, trying to make enough money to keep the household going. Her husband basically abandons her after World War II. So we really see her struggling not only to get ahead at the CIA and get these promotions and do the work that she's so passionate about, but just to keep her family together. And so each of these women just have really fascinating stories. And it was so interesting to learn about them, even though they're not with us anymore. I was lucky to be able to get in touch with their families and read their letters and diaries. And of course, I also interviewed many of their colleagues at the CIA and used the Freedom of Information Act to get more information there too. So it was definitely a process putting their lives together, but it gives you a really full picture of what it's actually like to work as a spy for the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in the book, you also talk about how they, they might not get sent overseas because they have children, whereas men with children were sent overseas quite freely. So it was really interesting that they were up against that too.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this great quote during the Petticoat Panel where one of the men talks about how women have hazards at home, which are, husbands and children. And of course, like, he doesn't mention that he has 3 kids at home himself. Like, that's not even part of the equation. So definitely during this period, during this Cold War period, there were many things they were fighting against.
Lauren, you include pieces in your book by or about women climbing as early as the 30s, 40s and 50s, when climbing, first of all, just wasn't as popular as it is now, but then also expectations for women were more like tied to the home. What brought these women to climbing in those early years, and what sense did you get of how that was sort of received from their male colleagues?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, even though climbing at that time was much more structured than it is today, you couldn't just go to REI and buy some climbing gear and go to the climbing gym and learn, right? You needed like a really kind of, there was really only one way into the sport, and it was that others had to teach you. And often that meant by joining a club in Yosemite. That was typically the Stanford Alpine Club, the Sierra Club, and you'd learn through their kind of regimented way. And women were often very included in those outing clubs. There's times, especially like during, periods of war, that women were even more involved than men were in those clubs, but their role in them was really different. And I've read some interviews since trying to get a sense of what that larger picture was like. And, Bee Vogel, who I talked about being the first woman leader, men at that time had been asked later, why weren't women leading? And they were often said, we just didn't think of them that way. Like, there wasn't a hard rule that they couldn't. They just often didn't. It didn't occur to them that women could be in that position. And I wonder if some of it has to do with the fact that women weren't involved in that many sports in general. Like, we see a huge boom in women's climbing by the late 70s and early 80s, which I imagine is quite related to Title IX and women being able to just be athletic in different ways, and viewing climbing as a sport. But at the time, before that, climbing was kind of just a mode of outdoor adventure. And so the women that were involved in it were typically very independent women already, who were the types of kids that grew up climbing trees or playing in the woods, and then kind of found this natural progression into climbing. And so they were often kind of accepted in the community, but in a following type of way. Climbing always has a leader and a follower, and it just felt really natural to climbers at the time that women would follow and men would lead, until women eventually became so good at climbing that they had to let them lead. And then other women started saying, wait, I want to lead too. And even women at the time who didn't lead, when later asked about it, said, well, it's not that anyone told me I couldn't, I just didn't know I could, right? And so having that example of someone to go before you, I think, is really important, because once that existed, there was an explosion of female leaders. And and just having one person to look to that looks like you, that you can do something, I think is really, really a game changer at the time.
I love in so many of the pieces how much they just love being in nature, how much they just love Yosemite, which everyone does. Like, of course, it's amazing. One of the letters in particular, I didn't write down the name of the person who wrote it, but she was so thrilled that she even found a skeleton at the bottom of the route that she just climbed, because everything was so amazing and incredible to her. So yeah, when I was reading it, there was just a sense of sort of openness too, of like anything is possible in the wilderness, which I don't know, maybe contributed also to their urge to climb. So
yeah, I mean, like, now you can go from being not outdoorsy to being a rock climber because of things like gyms, and classes and stuff. But climbing really came out of hiking, which became scrambling and peak bagging and getting more and more technical. So the roots of it, especially in those early days, you see in all climbers, men and women, just this deep love of wanting to be outside and to push their own limits. And they kind of, as they push their own limits, it really like pushed the whole sport forward.
Right. Jennifer, turning to you, the Nazis had a lot of peculiar ideas about women. And I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit to the place of women in German society at the time and how that's reflected in your three characters.
Well, the main role that women had in Nazi Germany was to bear children, to make a nice home for their families, but also to bear 4 or more children. The Nazi culture was really a cult of motherhood. I'll give you a quick example. They wanted to make sure that every family had at least 4 children. These were called child-rich families. So in order to incentivize this a bit, they started giving out iron crosses to women who gave birth to 4 children. You got an iron cross. 6 or more children, you got a silver cross, and after you had 8 or more children, you got a gold cross. And you would wear this necklace every day. And when members of the Hitler Youth or the Girls' Arm, the Bundesdeutsche Mädel, saw you on the street, they would have to stop and salute you as if you were the Führer himself. So women were given fake importance. They were told, you are the heart of the fatherland. You are the most important people other than the youth, because you can have children. But really, they had no power. Their only function really was to populate the ever-expanding Reich.
Yeah, and the character of Hildy was so interesting to me because she is fairly unquestioning about the Nazi orthodoxy, but she loves going to work and she loves being good at her job. And that sort of contrast between, knowing that she could be good at something, which is abhorrent, but still like that sort of pride that she took in that office job versus her new role as a pregnant woman. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about their sort of, each of those characters has ambitions.
Well, Hilda is very comfortable with her own hypocrisy. I found her an extremely frustrating and compelling character to write. I found myself often talking back to her because she's unquestionably delusional. Sometimes she would say, oh, it's because, Otto loves me. And I would sit here and just go, oh, he does not love you. But so she does love working in an office. She works at the Women's League in Berlin, and she's a bit ambivalent when she gets pregnant and is sad that she has to leave this office job. So her desire throughout the book is she wants a place of importance in the Reich. She hasn't been able to pursue her desire to be a comedian or an actress. Nobody wants to marry her. So this is the way she can rise to power, and she pursues it with great zeal. Fanaticism, which I learned during the research of this book, that being called a fanatic was a positive thing in Nazi Germany. That was like a compliment, like, oh, you're such a fanatic. Oh, thank you very much. I try my best to be a fanatic. And then what Gundi really wants and needs is to survive and to get her baby out of this Lebensborn home before the parentage, before the father's identity is discovered. And then Nurse Irma, she's a little bit more wishy-washy. She's kind of just going with the flow, and like a lot of people in Germany, she kept her head down and didn't really have any strong feelings about the Reich. And she wanted to connect with a family, with a familial environment, and she finds that at the Lebensborn. And just as she finds her place and she kind of hits her groove and sees herself as this mother character and an auntie, and the girls love her, then she discovers what the Lebensborn program really is and has to just decide, like, ooh, whose side am I on now that I know the whole story?
Yeah, all three of your books are built on such a foundation of research that is really impressive. And I was wondering if each of you could just speak as to something that surprised you or something that was extra hard to find out. Lauren, you addressed this a little bit with the photographs, but if there's anything else that springs to mind about things that cropped up in your research that may or may not be in the book, but that were just so fascinating to you. So let's start with you, Lauren.
Sure. Yeah, the research for this book was really interesting because, of course, in the present day climbers, I know a lot of them. A lot of them are my, peers and heroes and people that I could, reach out to online. But the further back I went in time, of course, that wasn't quite as possible. And I was able to, something that really helped me researching this book is by, I'd have a small list of women I wanted to talk to. And every time I got to talk to someone, I would just make a point to say, who else were you climbing with? Who else should I talk to? And really rely on their memory of the time. And occasionally, someone would say, I remember this one woman who was really good and she didn't really get very much credit. And you'd say, that's exactly, who I'm looking for. And, but the most interesting part, really, it's surprising to me, I think, is how much convincing I had to do of the women that I wanted to contribute, that their stories were worth contributing. I found no people that told me that this book in general wasn't a good idea and that they weren't excited about it. But the fact that I wanted them personally to be involved in it was something that I often had to kind of work against and convince the women that that their stories were worth writing down. And I think I don't know if part of that has to do with a pre-social media generation that isn't so comfortable sharing their personal lives publicly, but I think it also has to do with the fact that climbing literature before that was really only written by the people that were doing the first or the fastest or the best of something. And so making space to just be and to tell your story because you have an interesting story is something that I felt like we were really working against. And then was just such an interesting part of putting this whole thing together, not so much in the research, but in of actually once I found the women that I wanted to contribute, actually getting them to kind of start putting words on the page.
Natalia, you used a lot of Freedom of Information Act sources, a lot of declassified CIA documents. I can't even imagine what it was like to sort through all of that. Can you describe your process a little bit?
Yes, it was a multi-year process to go work with the CIA to get the Freedom of Information Act filed. And then when I was really able to sit down with them, it was actually in some ways actually easier than I thought it would be. The historians worked with me to ensure the accuracy of this book and did a review with me. And I was able to get a lot of classified documents from them. So I kind of like to joke, my last book was on Disney. So I kind of like to joke that it was easier to work with the CIA archives than Disney archives. But regardless, a big part of this book that was very unusual for me was not being able to think probably half of my interviews in the acknowledgments of the book, because I spoke with so many CIA officers who are still undercover. And they were just so generous to spend all this time talking with me, to tell me about their colleagues. Most of them had worked either with or under these women. And they just had these fascinating stories. And it just killed me how much I wasn't able to thank them or even acknowledge what their role was in any of these operations. It was such a strange thing. I've never had that happen before. But there's just nothing quite like having those two sides, being able to get the documents unclassified from the CIA and then being able to speak with the CIA officers who really lived through it. And I think it gives such a different perspective on these really big moments in our history in the Cold War.
Yeah, and Jennifer, you spoke a little bit in your intro about some of the research that you did. Unlike the others, you're writing a fictional book. So what was it like for you translating some of those firsthand accounts into fiction?
Well, I would say, so I didn't talk to women who participated in the Lebensborn Society because they have all passed away, sadly. But what I found really surprising was how easy it was to find out information about treaties and battles and major historical events, but much harder to get the small cultural details like, does a man zip, button, or snap his pants? I was shocked at how deep the propaganda went. I found an account of a family who was playing a family board game called Judenraus, where the object of the game is to run 6 Jewish pegs off to Palestine. So I really became fascinated with the tiny little mundane nuances that make a story rich. I'll tell you a really quick story, if I may, because sometimes you look for something and you realize you're asking the wrong questions and you're looking for the wrong information. And I had a scene where it was a flashback and I wanted a gentleman to throw a coin into a fountain and make a wish that this woman would marry him. So I called Rolf and I said, Rolf, do you Germans throw coins into the fountain to make a wish? And he could not even understand. He said, wait, why are you throwing money into a fountain? And I said, no, to make a wish. It doesn't, to make the wish. Did you do that? He goes, what? Why are we throwing money into the fountain? I said, Rolf, it's a penny. It's a pfennig. You throw a penny into the fountain, you make a wish. It sounds like you guys didn't do that because you seem very not familiar with this. He said, listen to me. If you have a scene where a German is throwing money into a fountain, I don't care if it's a pfennig or what, your next scene better be 6 Germans jumping into the fountain to fight for that pfennig. So I'm trying to figure out about if they're making a wish, and he's telling me, forget about it, they're not even parting with a pfennig. And do I have time for one quick story?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a scene where Hilda comes home and she smells that her mother is making rabbit stew. And I thought, okay, I made the rabbit stew so I could describe the smell of it. I was fully invested in this rabbit stew. And then I realized, you know what? It's April. Would they be eating stew in April, or is it too warm now to eat stew? So I called Ursula Heinzelmann, who is a food historian, who knew there was such a thing, but she's a food historian, leading expert on German food. And I asked her this question, and she said, that's not your problem. We would eat stew in April. Your problem is rabbit season ends in December. And this is in April. So I said, well, they're a very high-ranking Nazi family. So could they have an ill-begotten rabbit that they hunted whenever they felt like? And she said, well, they could. But in April, the rabbits are just coming out of hibernation. So the kind of rabbit you would get is stringy and skinny and not nice and juicy and plump like you'd want for a stew. So when you read Cradles of the Reich and you see this bit of internal dialogue where where Hilda says, I wonder where Mama found a rabbit this time of year, much less one plump and juicy enough to cook a Hofenpfeffer with. That was 4.5 hours worth of research. You're welcome.
It is the details that count, though, so I'm sure your readers will appreciate.
I found it fascinating, and I hope other people do too.
Well, we're drawing towards a close. I just wanted to do one sort of lightning round, last of questions before I turn it back over to Anne to wrap up for us. Takeaways. So, Jennifer, what did you want readers to take away about the historical events that you depict in Cradles of the Reich? That
no matter what the circumstances, however tragic, however trying they are, women are strong, and the relationships that we build and the bonds that we forge can carry us through anything.
Excellent. Natalia, what's the legacy of the women that you write about and their Petticoat Panel?
These are women that prevented war and really also fought for equity at the CIA at a time when it was just not common to do so. So these are definitely strong women with some interesting, complex histories that deserve to be recognized.
Great. And Lauren, what is the current state of affairs for women climbing in Yosemite as reflected late in your book?
The current state for women climbing Yosemite is looking very good. Women are really leading the way, putting up roots that men haven't been able to climb and doing all these amazing things. And I think that, yeah, knowing that we have this long lineage of belonging in a place like Yosemite, in a sport like rock climbing that is often represented as being super male dominated, I hope will continue to inspire more women to get involved in the sport, knowing that they really belong in this place.
Well, I just want to thank all three of you for writing your books and for coming here today and sharing them with us. This was a lot of fun for me. I hope it was a lot of fun for our invisible viewers. And thank you all so much.